Good morning, everyone. My name is Jared Morrison, and I'm an organization development consultant in the Learning and Organizational Development Unit for OSU Extension. And I'd like to welcome you in today for our first session in this new series of ACEL to Extension. I am posting the link in the chat box right now to go straight to our landing page, which has information just kind of generally about the series and about each of these sessions that is in this series. So we're very excited. This has been a great partnership. Myself and Beth Flynn have led the efforts. Beth works in the Department of Agricultural Communication, Education, and Leadership, or ACEL, as we'll commonly refer to it. And there's a link to that, to their page on our ACEL to Extension page as well. So be sure to check them out. But we do welcome you all in for this first session. And without too much further ado, I'm going to pass it over. Thank you to our first speaker to kick things off this year, Jerry Thomas, Dr. Jerry Thomas. Thanks so much. Talking about future issues that may impact extension. So I'll let you take it away, Jerry.
Okay, well, thank you and welcome everyone. I'm going to go right to sharing my screen. And as I do that, Jared or Beth, if questions come up in the chat box, if you can let me know, or if we can answer them at the end, that's fine. There'll be some other things coming up because I cannot see my chat box. And so,
okay. Yep, I'll keep an eye on that. So yes, everyone, please feel free to chat in along the way.
Yep, and so, can everyone see my screen before we get started? That's one of the first best questions. Good, thank you. We've already gone through the title and everything. And I have a question for everyone as we get started. And it is this. Do you think we, and that could be extension, it could be you or me, are we changing as fast or faster as the world around us? And you can either chime in or put that in the chat box. Probably with as many people we have on, it's better to put it in the chat box. But I give people just a few seconds to a minute, and yes, no, maybe.
Yeah, so Jerry, we've got quite a few people that have said no. We've got Diana said depends on the subject. I don't think so either. COVID has given us a push, that's for sure. Quite a few more no's. So yeah, it's like.
I've asked this question several times over the past maybe 4 or 5 years, and extension audiences are almost overwhelmingly no. Although I've had 1 or 2 people say, is that always a bad thing? Because it is somewhat subjective. And it is true depending on if you're asking. I'm thinking more in general with extension. So we're going to talk about that and some of the changes coming along and see where we stand with it and how they may impact us. Yep, as we move ahead. And okay, there we go. For some reason, let me move my slides ahead. A little bit about me. I saw some familiar names as people are coming on the screen. I saw some newer names. We've had some turnover of the last few years and younger people coming in. I've been with OSU Extension and ACEL, OSU Extension specifically, for over 30 years. And I started as a county agent in community economic development in Crawford and Morrow counties. I then become something that we don't have anymore, a district specialist, and 3 other things we don't have anymore, a district director, a regional director, and a center director. Those are all separate titles. And those all represent waves of restructuring and extension, by the way, where we've gone from one organizational structure to another, and so forth. And so I've been with leadership in ACEL since around 2009, and I've had a focus on innovation and futuring, stuff we're going to talk about today, mainly futuring and its impact. In the last 11 years, I've had several e-extension appointments. Most of you, I think, are familiar with e-extension. If not, it's extension.org. It's the funky spelling, the way they've branded it. And every time I put it on something for people outside of extension, they send it back and tell me I need to correct my spelling, but it's their branding. And so, including a stint for a couple of years as an associate director of e-extension and leading their innovation labs. So that's me. And going back to the chat box, just real quick, I don't know if we need to do name, title, location as much because as I saw people coming up. But if you could just briefly talk about what you think a trend or issue extension will face in the next 5 years. Just something briefly, and a challenge, an opportunity, a technology.
Yeah, so far, Jerry, we've got the effects of COVID-19 and recovering economically, funding pressures, virtual programming, more economic fallout from COVID, shifting the way we meet people where they are, um, COVID-19 and 4-H membership, communication and education, more virtual events. Evidence-based might not mean as much to our clientele. Connecting with clients virtually, funding issues, staying current with technology. Yeah, so there's quite a few more still coming in here.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
good
fine.
list
And
there
we'll
though.
capture some of those, yeah, as we move along. It starts to give me an idea of where we're at. And what I'm going to talk about, just a couple of things today, because we only have an hour roughly to do this. But I want to spend some time talking about demographics and going through that, and starting with the big picture, starting beyond the state of Ohio and even the United States, to give us a feel for where we're at, because we definitely have a global economy, we have a global pandemic, we have other things going on. So to see how America and the United States fits with the rest of the world, here's a quick table. And as you read this, from the very top, I think you can see my cursor probably. From the very top, where the world population in 2019 is 7.7 billion. In 2050, it's projected to be 9.73 billion. And what's interesting, as you go down through this, here's the United States. Right now, we're 2019, 329 million. It's closer to 330, 331 million now in 2020. We're still projected to grow. And a lot of our growth is coming both through immigration. Our birth rates have been dropping, although you see a little bit that varies between different groups. And so EU, the European Union, which is a collection of states minus the UK, are shrinking. They're at 747 million right now. They're going to go down to 706 million. So their proportion of world population will be dropping. I did not put Japan in here. And so, can you hear a dog barking in the background? A little bit. Okay, it's the dog that I put in the furthest part of the. I put in the furthest part of my house, and all of a sudden, seems to be incensed. So I apologize for that.
Okay.
The thing that really strikes me is if you look at China and India. Everyone knows China is big, but look at this: 1.43 billion. So of 7.7 billion people, 1.43 billion is a huge proportion of that. But one thing about China, everyone thinks China's growth is skyrocketing, but if you look at this, by 2050, roughly 30 years out, they're only growing by proportionally by a little bit. That's still a large number of people, but their growth rate has really stalled. And what you're seeing is India will eventually be the largest country in the world at 1.7 billion people. But it helps, and then sub-Saharan Africa is really experiencing huge population growth. And that's a collection of countries across the sub-Saharan region of Africa. But I think what it does is puts us into proportion about where the United States is at. And as we're dealing with countries like China as competitors, our size relative to them, to give you an idea of just some of the stuff we're facing. And it's why China is the largest car market in the world as far as buying cars. They're a large number of their, by proportion or percentage of the population, are still poor, but because they're so big, their middle class is big enough to start doing that. And that's why companies like Telsa have located manufacturing plants into China. At the same time, a number of suppliers have been locating out of China because of trade restrictions with the United States, but they're not all coming back to the United States. A lot of them are gone to Vietnam, Thailand, and other countries in that area. I used to, when I do this face-to-face, sometimes I'll have people bring up like a group of 10 people, and then a group will go off to the side and stand about how many represent China, how many represent India, and then there's like a half a person representing the United States. So it's to me, it's a way to frame and start thinking about where we are globally and within the world. And so this is, in the United States, this is looking between 2018 and 2060. I was trying to find stuff between 2020 and 2050, and there's the data just doesn't all match up. But this is our trend lines, and you can see these are growth rates, what percentage growth rate here on the left-hand side. And then across the bottom are the years. And so as you look at this, what you can see is the blue line or the line at the top is minority growth. So non-white growth, basically. The line at the bottom is white growth. The yellow line is total growth. And here is 0. So if you have 0 growth, means you're having as many people born as are dying, basically. That's the starting point of where we're at, moving along here. And you can see the white population is growing and will grow at a slower rate over time projected. Non-white is declining. Their growth rate is slowing, but they're not slowing as fast as the white rate. And so you see that we're becoming a less white nation as we move along. You can already see that now, and you can see it. It varies from in Ohio. If you're in one county versus another county, you can see totally different populations with that. So this is a pie chart. I apologize. I had cut and paste this over, and it looks distorted. It looks more like an egg, and it should look like a circle, but I had a hard time getting it to fit, to making it large enough to see. And this is in 2045, so again, trying to get close to 2050. Here is the rate of 49.7%. This is, as you can see, this is a year that whites become a minority. And you can see large growth rates here with Hispanic, Asian, African-American, Black, and an area that I think is probably going to increase more than this 3.8% are multiracial couples and so forth. I was surprised that rate was as low as it was. These are population pyramids. If you're not familiar with them, they're called pyramids because traditionally when they were developed, they look like this. They're a good way to look at the proportion of people that are female and male and by age. And so on the left-hand side, these are by age groups, and these are by millions of people. And in 1960, it's pretty clear if you look at the bottom of the pyramid or the base of the pyramid, we had a lot more younger people than at the top, older people. And what has changed over time, and this is a model that programs like Social Security are based on, because Social Security requires people in this group, the working group, to pay in to support this group. It's a transfer, it's not a pension plan. And so when you hear discussions about Social Security hurting, it's because of this over here. We've moved from a pyramid to more of a barrel. I mean, it looks more like an oblong barrel. And if you look at it, this is a projection again in 2060, as close to 2050 as I could find. If you look at it, what's really interesting to me is our success. People are living longer, and you're starting to see that. They're enjoying it, but you're not having the same level of the dynamic has changed as far as transfer payments and support and other things. And with people living longer, they demand different services. There are other things, and at some point, you need people, employed to do that. And so, this gives us an idea of what the future is going to look like, and so forth. So, technology and information. I want to shift away from demographics to that, and so I'm going to step away just for a second and let the dog out because he is barking like crazy. And I apologize so much for that, but I will be right back. You may see a flash of a dog.
I think many of us are pretty familiar with coworker interruptions or chit chat, whether that's kids, pets, partners, whatever it may be. Sounds like he may not be too long, but maybe as we're waiting, just write maybe one of the issues you are dealing with technology and information as he comes back now.
So sorry about that. Did I miss something or? So anyways, can you all hear me? Okay. I'm getting glaring eyes for the dog, but he at least has shut up. So again, I apologize for that. That's very embarrassing. I do want to talk about technology and information as we move a little bit away from demographics and what that looks like. And People are always interested in how we're doing with technology. When I ask that first question about are we changing as fast as the rest of the world, people tend to think about technology a lot with that answer. Are we keeping up with what everyone else is using? And there's really three key things that I would like to talk about. One is the rise of formulas and algorithms. And people are probably wondering what that means, and I'll explain that in a second. The other is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a very hot topic. It is not what my dog has. It's something different, it's more technical related. And then automation. What is happening around automation? Because that has a big impact on our economy and what we're doing. And so when I say rise of formulas or algorithms, what I'm really getting at is what we're doing in computer science primarily. And these are mathematics or sets of rules in the software that are developed that let us go into things like artificial intelligence and other options. And you see this with the rise of Amazon. I'm old enough to have had Amazon in the late 1990s. And at that time, when you went on Amazon, they might recommend another book. If you bought this book, here's something you might be interested in. And it was based more on subjects. So if you bought a history book, they might recommend another history book. What's that evolved to over time as they make their formulas stronger and stronger is that you now get recommendations based on the formula. So you may buy a book on history and get a romance novel or something else totally different recommended, and it's working. And every time that happens, every transaction, that program gets smarter and smarter because it's collecting the information and using it. And so it's to the point that Amazon for years have had, if Jared and I were both on Amazon at the same time on separate computers, we would see a different screen because they're customizing that information as long as we're logged in. And part of that artificial intelligence, or part of what that leads to is we've been talking about, and that is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is basically, it's not a robot coming to take over the world or anything like that, at least not yet. It's a set of, again, those formulas of programs that allow software, and then the stuff that software runs, computers and other applications, to start mimicking human thought. So it starts trying to mimic it. And we're very clunky now. We're at a very early stage of it, but it lets the software learn. So every time it has an encounter, like we talked about before, it learns stuff. The artificial intelligence, you also hear terms like machine learning or deep learning. A great example of that, of deep learning with artificial intelligence, is online loan applications. And you see those advertisements everywhere to apply, go to your phone and apply. And what is happening is you're interacting with a software that is learning from you and is prompting you to move along, and is based in and the software is making your loan decision. Does this person get a loan or not? And so as it goes through that, it's adopting and learning things. And so one bank, for example, what they found out is the software formula was approving rates for people who filled the form out faster. And as humans, we don't know exactly why they're doing that. The assumption is that people that fill it out faster in general are much better prepared and have different ideas. So that's part of the world we're moving into. And you'll see this with a lot of our interactions online, our chat boxes and other things that literally look like you're talking to a human, but you're not. You're talking to the system. Some examples of these, some of these you may or may not be familiar with. Target is one. Target about 6 or 7 years ago had a major issue in that they had a young under 18 lady who went through and bought several things, and then because she was using a card, the store is tracking her. And so what happens is, what all stores do now is they send you targeted marketing advertisements. So again, Beth may get a totally different advertisement than I do from Kroger or from other places based on our purchases. Well, with Target's case, what happened is this young female started getting coupons and special offers for baby products. And her father became very upset and didn't understand why this was happening and why a young teenage minor was doing this. And so he called Target's corporate headquarters in Minneapolis. He It's told someone to call him back. They called him back a couple of days later, and he had to apologize because he found out his daughter was actually pregnant. And so the algorithm, the formula, knew this in some ways before the parents, and maybe even before the daughter. So that's the strength of where these are heading. I've already mentioned Amazon. I put voice recordings down here because I thought it was kind of a neat but also creepy thing. So when you call for customer service, you get put on hold, or you usually hear a recording that says this call is being recorded for training purposes or for some other thing. Well, that database is also stored, and so the those databases are now being used in ways to figure out, for example, voice inflection. So that's entered in the software. So if you call your cable company, they can tell through the software system before you even talk to a human, assuming you do, is this person calling because he's very upset and he can't figure something out, or is she calling because she simply wants to know, how do I plug this in? How do I get this to work? She's not mad. So they can tell that and route those calls based on that. I have Ask an Expert here, and I want to talk about it here instead, and talk about what does this mean for extension? What are potential ways of doing this? What is artificial? How's it going to impact us? And one area right now, the major area I can find of a group working on this is the extension and Ask an Expert. And if you're not familiar with Ask an Expert, it's a system that allows clientele to submit a question online, but it's asynchronous, not synchronous. Synchronous means if I ask a question online, I talk to someone directly automatically. Libraries have been doing this for years. We're behind in having a system like that. So our system's fairly clunky, and Ask an Expert, it's a national system. Questions go in, they get routed to someone who could answer it. That person may or may not answer it right away. And so it may be anywhere from minutes to days or more before that clientele question gets answered. And so what the extension is doing with the federal grant is investing money in trying to move an artificial intelligence program into Ask an Expert. And what it'll look like, what they hope it looks like, this is about a year away, is someone asks a question, and because, let me step back just for a second, in the Ask an Expert system, every question and every answer is put into a database, so it's always there. And that was meant for people, the humans in the system. If a question comes in about yellow jackets in August, they can go into that system and find people that have already answered the question and either cut and paste parts of that or use part of it, versus going back and finding everything themselves. And so with that database, what the extension plans on doing is adding a chatbot feature. So if you click Ask an Expert on the Ohio State page or any other page, a bot will pop up, and it will say, here, what is your question? And it will try to analyze that and say, for example, with the yellow jacket questions in August, here are some past answers. Do these help you? And if not, then it gets moved up to a human that answers and takes over and does it. It's extremely complex. And in our system, what's unique is we're a large country with based on geography, and we get large numbers of particularly home, yard, and garden questions that are going to be challenging that system on what is the right answer and what is a valid answer. But I think it's a step in the right direction, and they're doing that. One of the problems Extension has on a state-by-state basis is we're fairly siloed. Ohio works with Purdue, they work with Michigan State, but our databases, how we collect information, are all different. And you need to have a fairly large database for this to work, and it has to be a standardized database. And this is not just a problem with Extension, it's a problem in the private sector, particularly the smaller companies that might use accounting software for one thing, data management or contact management for another. So it's a thing to work out and look at. From an extension perspective, Purdue University has barely been working with small businesses on this. How do they start standardizing as part of their extension community development outreach? So tied to this is automation. And what I mean by automation is how do we automate different things? You see this mostly, most people think about this as far as robotics in factories. So for example, I worked at a General Motors plant, a foundry in Defiance, Ohio in 1985 between my high school and first year of college. And it was a dirty, grimy place. It was loud. They poured metal. There were about 5,000 people that worked there. Today, that plant is automated. They've moved a lot of it out, and it's more like walking into a cafeteria. It's more quiet. There's machines working everywhere. There's still humans. There's about 1,000 people working there, but it's had an impact. It's had an impact in that um, it's made the company more competitive. It's also been more of a reason why um, we've had job loss in manufacturing. We blame the Chinese and others, and there is some of that of jobs offshoring. But the bigger culprit has been automation, and how do we automate different systems? And I would think about this for extension in a couple of ways. One is the impact this will have on our communities, and it has had on our communities. If you look at Ohio, particularly Northern Ohio, Western Ohio, have, especially in our, not especially, but a lot of our rural areas have been dependent on manufacturing. And as that has changed over time, it's changed the scope of that. And in the plant that I mentioned, you're hiring people with 2-year technical degrees and things like that, and people with a high school degree that used to be able to leave and get a fairly well-paying job. Those jobs aren't there the same as they are in the past. This also applies an extension and on going back to artificial intelligence and other ways we may automate. And if you can think of other professions like accounting, the rise of software accounting, the stuff you're doing with that, or even starting in the 90s when almost every small town had a travel agency. As those things become more online and there's automated functions to do that, it changes the scope of things. And so here's a question for the chat box, since I've been talking again for a while. And so here's a question for you. Zoom meetings have you been in this month? Just place a number in there and you can count this one as part of it. Jared has a prize for the one of the most meetings.
It's another Zoom meeting.
There you go.
Just realized I was muted again. A lot of people are saying 20. There's quite a few 15s. Somebody said 1,267,000.
Sounds like a rounding error.
Too many to count. 10,000. It seems like at least 30. Somebody said, yeah. So too many to count is pretty popular as well.
So we're 17 days into the month, and those are total days, not business days. And so if you start adding and dividing those up, that's a lot of Zoom meetings. And so I'm assuming that one of the number one complaints I have when I talk to people is Zoom fatigue. And part of it, I think, goes, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, of pushing us into the future, where I think this is part of our future, but I think there's a learning curve with that. And so, for example, I mentioned I've been around for 30 years. I started before email was at Ohio State University. And I started at a time when most of the computers in an office were with the 1 or 2 receptionists, or at that time, secretaries, whatever, and they had the only computers. And your operating system was not in the computer, it was on a floppy disk, and you save things to floppy disk versus your computer. But what happened is email came along in the early to mid 90s. And like a lot of the things that we do in extension, it was mandated, but not enforced. So we mandated and said everyone had to do it, but let people get it on their own. And it took a while for it to get rolling and moving along. And part of the issue was most of the, at that time, agents would write, they'd have a legal pad, and they'd write stuff out in longhand, give it to a clerical person. That person would type it up, give it back to them to proof, give it back and forth, and they would mail it. We were at the advent of just having fax machines. but that was more for business to business, not to person to person. And so what happened when we started doing email, it was a huge transition because people, first off, a lot of people that didn't know how to type. And so they were hunting and pecking, and they didn't know how to write emails. They would try to write that whole long letter into an email, and it just didn't work out. And it took a long time for people to type a single email. And so what I would hear when I go to meetings is, I am so overwhelmed. This email thing, I had 5 emails the other day and I can't keep up with it. And so I think we're kind of that way with Zoom, where we haven't figured out how to use it. I do our internship program for our undergrads in ACEL, and the ones that got caught in the transition last spring, where they were working in different offices, and they weren't all extension offices, and then had to go to working from home and all of a sudden use Zoom. Most of the students were pretty familiar with it, but it was a learning experience for us. And I think one of the things we need to figure out is, when is it appropriate to just have a phone call? When is it appropriate to have email? Do we have to do Zoom for everything? No. So I think there's a learning curve with that. So I appreciate the feedback, including the very large numbers of 100,000. But I do think that's a good information to share widely. The fact, if you're having 15 to 20 meetings already this month and you're only 17 calendar days into the month, that's quite a few meetings per day. And so some thoughts on technology as we start to move beyond this. To me, one of the thoughts is COVID-19 and the economic slowdown are really forcing some of the future of work and technology upon us. So things that I think would have happened slowly over time, more people working at home, more web-based meetings, have really been forced on us faster. So I think we're moving into the future as we do this, and we're learning from it. We're learning from it. And you see this all across society. You see it in our school systems. I have a granddaughter who was in 6th grade last year when this happened. And I tried to help her with her online work. And some of it were, books that had been photocopied. And it was like the old days when you photocopy a book and some pages are like turned sideways a little bit because they're in a hurry. And it was a system issue. It wasn't a personal issue. It was because teachers at that school had to wait in line to use the copier to get stuff done, because they weren't going to be in the office or the school setting the very next time. They were forced to do that. So I think we've learned from that. We have some more deliberate as we start to move ahead, and people are getting used to it. And so the second quote here is from William Gibson, who is a science fiction writer, and he actually wrote this in the 1980s. And I just thought it fit where we're at in it. It said, "The future is here. It is just not evenly distributed." And so a lot of the things we've been talking about have to do with equity and technology. And by equity, I'm meaning across the systems, not just racial equity or age equity, although those are part of it. It could be geographic equity. We see that here in Ohio, where some counties lack broadband, and even in some cases, very poor cell coverage. And we have clientele on that. Then we have other counties that are getting 5G or 5th generation cell phone technology that allows videos to be downloaded very rapidly. So I think we need to realize that from a statewide perspective, even a national perspective, is a lot of these things are happening. A lot of things that some people could take for granted are not accessible for other people. Not everyone has a computer, but a vast majority of people have a smartphone. So what does that look like in the way we deliver technology and how we interact with our clientele? Some of the impacts, remote work came up. For some reason, Ohio State and the United States government use the term telecommuting, which to me sounds so much like the 1980s when you're thinking of telephones versus the technology we have now to work with. And so I guess a few thoughts with this of where we're heading. USU is Utah State University. They actually have a remote work certificate program. And what they base that on is looking at master volunteer programs like Master Gardener, where you go through and get a certificate. And most people are familiar with Master Gardener or Master Naturalist. We did some research, just online research a couple of years ago, and found in the United States Extension, there was almost right around 35 different distinct master volunteer programs. And so they're great ways of leveraging resources. But what Utah State is doing is they're not looking to create a volunteer pool base. What they did is, if you've ever been to Utah, it is a very, very rural state outside of Salt Lake City and a few other places. And it doesn't have the transportation routes other than some interstates. And there was a county commissioner in Utah who was doing his work thing. He was working with his brother, and I can't remember the exact what they were doing, working with what their product or so was. But what they were doing was they were out. It was online, and they were outsourcing parts of the job. And you notice over time that none of those, they're gone all across the United States to people to do different bits of bit work or gig work, as it's called. None of it was happening in Utah. And so they approached both the legislature and Utah State University Extension on how can we prepare ourselves. And so their remote work certificate is based on people applying to get into it. And there's essentially, as far as I can tell in talking to them, roughly two sets of people who are entrepreneurs and want to get online and sell things and do things on their own, and people who want a job and are willing to work for folks like an airline to do reservations. So they either want to work on their own, or they're looking to work for what used to be called call centers or things like that, where they used to have a call center with this massive room with all these people, are now distributed with people working at home. And so they do a certificate program where they go through training, not only how to use stuff like Zoom, but how to interact, what is proper and not proper. And it's been so far fairly successful, but it's been funded. It's a major economic development initiative. It's over $1 million have been put into the program. They have gone through at least one round. There is a webinar next week, and it's NAEPSDP. If you go to their site, that's one of the 7 or so extension groups. And Paul Hill is the person who's doing it. Paul's pretty well known in a lot of the technology and innovation circles in extension. But I thought it was a really unique way, a couple of years that started approximately 2 years ago, before our current crisis, of someone identifying part of what's happening right now. It was already a trend moving up, and now it's accelerated because of coronavirus and the economics. But it was a way, and it was an extension way of looking at that. And they have working, I think, right now with Purdue, maybe replicating that, and something they'd be interested in helping other states replicate. So workforce changes, I don't know, and it'd be interesting, and I don't know this, if you want to throw it in the chat box, I'm going to keep on talking. Do people like working remotely, just yes or no? If you could throw that in there. Because I think we're looking at some pretty drastic workforce changes, not just extension, but especially corporate white collar America. What I'm hearing from folks in the corporate sector is, particularly in areas like downtown Columbus, where real estate is very expensive, you have to pay for parking, is that they can get by if people can work from home, either full-time or part-time. They can decrease the amount of space they need. And so I think there's a trend coming up with that. And I have economic impacts down here. It does have huge economic impacts, because if you're no longer going to a physical location, for Columbus is a good example, you're no longer paying parking. So do you need as many parking garages? What happens with that? You're no longer maybe buying a cup of coffee at downtown at a Starbucks or a local cafe. You may not be going out to eat 3 or 4 times a day. You're not paying for as much gas. You may not be buying an automobile as often as you would. So there's all these ramifications going through, including things like sales tax, income tax. So if you live in one community and pay an income tax in another community, or they have an offset, at some point you continue to do that. Does your official work site change? And what does that do for the tax base? And in turn, for what that tax base provides, which extension is one thing. And so it does have impacts with it. But the changes, I don't know, Jared, if people are saying yes or no, they like it, or.
Yeah, so most people, probably the majority, said yes. Some people said both. Some people said they do, but they do like going back into the office, once a week or a couple times a month, a little bit of both. So, yeah. Depends on the day is another one.
It's we had an experiment when I was the Northwest District Director, and we went through another round of restructuring, and we went from 5 districts to 4. Um, we reassigned people from as far away as Zanesville to Findlay, and what we agreed to do instead of having people relocate was to try a virtual office, and it worked fairly well. It was before we had stuff like Zoom. We used AIM. This would have been around 2004. So we had instant messaging and different ways of communicating and so forth. It did impact. There was at least one person in our office who was no longer with Extension, but he hated it. He wanted to be in the office every day, and he missed seeing people. When he was there and there was no one there, it was like walking into almost a deserted building, because our support staff were all there. I was there most days. Now people who were in and out. So it's not for everyone. Some of the latest polling I have seen is from Wells Fargo. It came out the other day, and of employees that were working from home, about a third of them still wanted to stay from home, but a huge number, somewhere around 70%, wanted to do some kind of blended approach. So in other words, I'll work from home 3 days a week and come in 2 days, or vice versa, or 1 day. And the number one reason that they wanted to come in, if I remember right, was socialization. They missed sort of connecting with people, being able to stop by the person's office and seeing them face to face. It's just different than Zoom when you see everyone face to face. And so those are some of the changes. I have technology infrastructure down here, and that really is about, once we shift to working from home, in the case of OSU, in my opinion, it's been, we'll give you support and a computer, but you're going to use your own internet, you're going to use your own printer. And how do we think through it? The private sector has been more generous, and they can afford to be more generous in some cases. But what do you do about that technology infrastructure? What do you do with, like right now, before people got on, I was having wireless connectivity, so you made my phone, as my personal phone, as a mobile hotspot. How do you adjust for that? How do you do? Beth was talking about upgrading, the amount of data she has in just her internet plan, because they'll start slamming you and slowing your connections down. Who pays for that? You really would need a commercial connection in your house if you're expected to do business level work. And so I think that technology infrastructure and support are pretty important. I've already talked about some of the economic impacts. I will say the team that I lead at the OSU Leadership Center, the Futuring team, our research project for the next year is looking at remote work and its impacts, primarily in extension settings. What works, what doesn't work, what do we think is going to happen in the future, where do we go to, what are policy decisions for that, what are insurance decisions for that, what are workers' comp decisions. There's a lot that goes into this that we're still trying to figure out as we do this. And the other side of this are managers. It was very clear from the beginning of this that many managers were very uncomfortable with people working from home. They thought if they could not see them in a seat working, it doesn't work out. And so we're learning, what are new management things? How do we give people freedom and expectations? And by the way, almost every study I've seen has indicated that people put more hours in when they work from home than they work in the office. Now, there's a little bit of offset with travel and to the office, but most people are putting more hours in, but they're putting them in differently. They may not be 8 to 5, they may be 2 in the morning or whatever. One last thing on this, and it's Best Buy did a program back in the early 2000s. I'm trying to think of the name of it, but it essentially was allowed workers in the corporate setting, not the Best Buy stores that you go to, the lock stores, but it allowed them to work where they wanted to, and it was results-based management, results-oriented work environment, ROWE. And what they would do is you would meet with the manager throughout the year, and then you chose where you wanted to work. If you wanted to work in a park for part of the time, you could do that. If you wanted to work in the office, you could do that. And the idea was you were measured not on how many committees you sat on or activities. You were measured on, here are the 3 or 4 things that I want to do or that we need to do, and what are the outcomes. So move on here. The other impact with remote is remote learning. I think people mentioned that at the very beginning. This has been a huge impact on our youth. It has not been popular in most places. It's been nice to have kids at home, but it has a big impact on parents' work. Most of us in Extension have been fortunate with this that we could work from home. A lot of other folks cannot do that. So how do we do that? Also in adults, what's happening with adults? I'm teaching adult learning and development graduate level class right now, and this has been a topic. How do we connect with adults, particularly older adults who are not used to using technology, who still have trouble with a flip phone and, and so forth, and including some extension folks who are talking about how they work with fair boards, and fair boards initially not liking it, but now wanting to keep using it, where they have blended meetings, some people coming in, other people wanting to join by Zoom versus making the drive in or so forth. So I think there's an adoption as we move ahead with that. How do you do informal learning? How do you do demonstration learning for 4-H where you might do things? How do you do things if you're in community development? You normally facilitate meetings with people coming together and doing things and writing on the wall and stuff. How do you do that? And then what's the impact on teachers and instructors? I can personally say that teaching an online class requires more hours than teaching a face-to-face class in general. There's maintenance, there's trying to figure everything out, there's posts to read, and so forth. So I think we're still looking at the impact of that. I think we're going to get better at that. I think we're going to start seeing stuff coming out about best practices in that. So I mentioned automation and some of the impacts. I do want to give an example of that just very quickly. This is sort of jumping around a little bit, and I apologize. I mentioned automation and its impact on the economy. I want to talk about the trucking example. And by trucking, I mean semi-trucks and doing that. Right now, semi-truck drivers are one of the few high-paying jobs that someone with a high school degree can get. I've seen companies in at least in Northwest Ohio, Northeast Indiana, paying people $70,000 a year with very limited experience, simply because there's a demand for truckers. There's a demand they can't keep up with building the trucks and the equipment that goes with it. But if you think of automation, and we have a lot of conversation now about automated cars, think about what happens when you start automating trucks. The thought of that freaks most people out. At the thought of going along I-75 or I-71 with an automated truck passing at 70 miles an hour is not very comforting. But once we have that technology now, where do those jobs go? So it's a pretty good example of where we're heading with automation. And so I went in with just a very quick story, and I'll make it short because I want to be able to answer any questions. I hear a lot, as I go by here, a lot of praise and criticism for stores like, or companies like Amazon. Some people like it, some people use it, some people think it's ruining the economy. And I thought it'd go good to look back in time and go to the early 1900s in the United States. And at that time, if you lived in a rural area, you didn't have mail delivered to you. There was no mail delivery. You had to go to your town, either go to a post office, more often a store. And the stores at that time were usually, there's only one or two stores, grocery type stores in town. And they weren't the groceries like we're used to. Those groceries didn't come along until the 1930s. You'd walk in, and if you saw Little House on the Prairie or any older movies, you walk in and you write an order down, and the clerk goes and brings it out to you, and you get all the supplies you need. And often you would get your mail there. That's where it'd be delivered. And so you may go there twice a month and pick it up. Well, a couple things happened that changed that totally. One was the advent of automobiles. When automobiles first started becoming very popular in the 1900s, it forced the governments, local government, federal government, to start developing roads, to have passable roads. Once that happened, it allowed for the introduction of real free, this says development, I don't know why it's a typo, it's real free delivery. So RFD, if you ever heard that term, if you've grew up in the country, that was federal legislation that allowed mail to go directly to your home, and it let you bypass going to that retail store to pick up your stuff. What it also let was entrepreneurs come in, and one of those was Sears and Roebuck. And this may be a younger audience, but some of you may remember the old Sears catalogs. You would get one, and usually a Christmas one and a general one, and you could order anything up to homes, dresses. And what happened is people had a choice. Instead of going to that one store in their town, they could start ordering from their home and have it delivered to the home, because they had the government putting in roads. they had the government introduction of rural free delivery, and then they had the entrepreneurs who came in and took advantage of that. And so if you think of what we have now, we have the government putting in and developing most of the internet. We still have some government and also private sector delivery, and you have companies like Amazon. So we've been down this road before. So I just thought that'd be a good example to throw in, and also make us think about what that means to think entrepreneurially and innovative. So I'll put this up here just for a second, because I think innovation is the key for us to get through this. I think we're very innovative. People come up with unique ways of conducting meetings and so forth. Our forage professionals, I think in particular, have always been very creative in how they work with people and how they interact and build interactivity and so forth into things. And part of this, the last part of this, I think, is, or the first sentence is the obvious, that we have these obvious ideas from the past and the way it's always been. But if we use innovation, we have to unlearn it and discover the future. And if you think about the slide, when I said the future is being pushed into us, it's pushing us in that direction. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think there's scary things. There's going to be some tough financial times ahead. There's uncertainty about COVID-19, what's going to happen, particularly in October, November. It is interesting. We have Big Ten football, but it's starting at the time that we may have the peak of it. And so we'll have to wait and see. So with that, I'll quit. I'll put this up here. Here are my contact information. The questions in the chat box would be great. If you want to contact me, it's all there. And also you can see the, for more information on other programs and so forth, there's our Leadership Center website. So I will stop there. And if there are questions from building up or anything else, or
yeah, and
people
thank you.
Thank God this is over. Anything else?
Thank you so much, Jerry. I think that's this is great way to start off. Great way for us to think ahead to the future and how we might be impacted. To all of our attendees, before you hop off, there is a link there in the chat box to give us a little bit of feedback on today's session, but it also gives you an opportunity to suggest future topics. Futuring, no pun intended there, but make sure you take some time to give us your feedback there. And then, yes, as Jerry mentioned, we have some time for questions. So if you want to type them in, or you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask aloud too. And as people are thinking, I'll also post again the link to our landing page, so it has registration for the remaining sessions in this series. And Jerry, there is one here. I'm not sure if you can see the chat yet. It's a delayed thought, possibly similar to our own economical impacts, but we are still paying taxes for the city our office is located in, but many of us do not live in that city. And for some, we haven't entered that city of our office for about 6 months. Yes, there's another impact, the tax implications.
Yep, that's what part of what I was talking about. And I don't live in Columbus, but Columbus is my quote destination or home base, and so I'm paying income taxes there. If that would stop, that's a big impact on Columbus. But then my city waives that. They've been very generous. They may not be, in the near future, as with the economic downturn, there may be more. They may want to claim that in addition. So. One thing I've noticed on other webinars, in the last couple of months, I've been on a couple this week, people ask fewer questions verbally and a lot more questions in the chat box and as they go along. So.
I don't see anything else coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Okay. We'll hang around for a few more minutes in case anyone has anything. But yeah, thanks again, Jerry and Beth, again, for your support and involvement, and to the entire department of ACEL. Again, this has been a great partnership, and we appreciate you all being here today. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in October. We have time management from Dr. Scott Shear on October 15th. So please head over and register for that. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.